Marcus pulled into his driveway after another long day at work, carrying a bag of groceries with one hand and his phone with the other, feeling quietly proud because after years of hard work, life finally seemed to be getting easier. Just a few months earlier, he had received the promotion he had been hoping for, and he walked out of his manager's office, believing that earning more money would finally allow him to build real financial security. During the first few weeks, everything felt different because paying bills no longer felt stressful. Filling up the gas tank didn't require checking his account first, and there was finally room to breathe. As time passed, Marcus found himself choosing the slightly better coffee, ordering dinner instead of cooking after exhausting work days, and paying for little conveniences that simply made life feel easier. None of those decisions felt expensive, reckless, or irresponsible, because each one came with a perfectly reasonable explanation that made saying yes feel completely natural. The changes happened so gradually that Marcus never felt like he was spending more money. He simply felt like he was enjoying the rewards of working harder than he ever had before. Then, one quiet Saturday morning, he sat down at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, opened his banking app, and expected to see months of steady financial progress waiting for him. Instead, he stared at the screen much longer than expected because his savings account looked almost exactly the same as it had before he ever received the raise. At first, he assumed he must have forgotten about some large purchase, so he began scrolling through months of transactions looking for the obvious explanation. He expected to find an expensive vacation, a major repair, or some reckless shopping spree, but none of those things were anywhere to be found. Every transaction looked ordinary, from groceries and gasoline to streaming subscriptions, coffee, lunches during work, and everyday purchases that most people would never think twice about. The more Marcus searched, the more confused he became, because nothing in his spending looked dramatic enough to explain why another raise had quietly disappeared. He leaned back in his chair and realized something that made him even more uncomfortable. He couldn't actually explain where the extra money had gone. It wasn't that he had failed financially, and it wasn't that he had made one terrible decision, yet somehow earning more money hadn't changed his financial life nearly as much as he expected. That single realization stayed in his mind for days because it forced him to ask a question he had never seriously considered before. Before we continue, welcome to Lyon Invests. This channel isn't about getting rich overnight. It's about questioning the financial beliefs that shape how we earn, spend, save, invest, and build wealth. Because what sounds true about money isn't always the full story. If you enjoy exploring the hidden psychology and systems behind financial decisions, consider subscribing. Every video is designed to challenge assumptions and help you become a more thoughtful financial thinker. One quick note before we continue. I'm not a financial advisor. I simply enjoy researching financial psychology, behavioral economics, and investing. Everything shared here is for educational purposes to help you think more critically and make more informed financial decisions. Now, let's see what this story is really revealing. Marcus thought he was trying to understand why his paycheck never seemed to last, but he was actually standing at the beginning of a much bigger discovery that had very little to do with income. The real mystery wasn't why money disappeared. The real mystery was why a habit so ordinary could quietly reshape an entire financial future without ever feeling like a mistake. Marcus spent the next several evenings reviewing old bank statements, convinced that if he looked carefully enough, one obvious mistake would finally explain why earning more had changed so little. Instead of finding one expensive purchase, he found hundreds of ordinary ones, each so small and familiar that none of them seemed important enough to question. A nicer cup of coffee before work, another streaming service, faster internet, food delivered after a long day, and small upgrades that quietly blended into everyday life. Individually, every decision looked completely harmless, but together, they had quietly absorbed almost every extra dollar that had once seemed destined for savings. That was the first clue, because the biggest financial habits rarely announce themselves as habits while they're being formed. They arrive one small decision at a time until repeating them no longer feels like making a choice, but simply living an ordinary life. Marcus realized he hadn't actually been asking whether he needed those improvements anymore, because they had slowly become part of what he considered normal. Once something becomes normal, the mind stops treating it like an optional expense and starts protecting it as though it has always belonged there. That explained why spending less suddenly felt uncomfortable, even though he had lived perfectly well without those same comforts only a year earlier. The strange part wasn't that his income had increased. The strange part was how quickly his expectations had increased right alongside it. Every raise had quietly rewritten his definition of an ordinary day, and he never noticed the change because it happened one small improvement at a time. His paycheck had become larger, but so had the invisible list of things that now felt completely reasonable to keep paying for every month. Marcus finally understood that money doesn't always disappear because people are careless. Sometimes it disappears because comfort quietly becomes a permanent expense. Imagine pouring more water into a bucket every month while tiny holes are slowly drilled into the bottom, each one so small that you never notice it until the bucket refuses to fill. The stronger the flow from the faucet became, the more water escaped through those new holes, leaving the bucket looking almost unchanged, despite receiving much more. Marcus realized his raise had been like turning the faucet higher, while his growing lifestyle had quietly added another tiny hole every few weeks. No single hole emptied the bucket, and no single purchase emptied his paycheck, but together, they quietly kept him standing in exactly the same place. For the first time, Marcus stopped blaming his income and started questioning the invisible process that kept expanding his everyday life without asking permission. That discovery answered where the money had gone, but it uncovered an even bigger mystery about why the brain keeps encouraging this pattern in the first place. Because if this habit feels completely natural, then perhaps the real problem isn't spending money at all, but the hidden way the human mind quietly defines what is enough. Marcus started noticing something he had ignored for years. Every improvement quickly stopped feeling special, and quietly became his new normal. The excitement of earning more lasted only a few weeks, but the new expenses remained long after the excitement disappeared. That wasn't an accident. It was how the brain naturally adapts. Psychologists call it hedonic adaptation, but Marcus simply experienced everyday life. Yesterday's luxury quietly became today's expectation without asking for permission. Once expectations change, satisfaction quietly resets back to where it started. Marcus wasn't chasing happiness anymore. He was maintaining a lifestyle. That difference completely changed how every future paycheck would be spent. Imagine walking up an endless staircase that builds another step beneath your feet. Every step upward feels like progress until the staircase grows just as quickly. No matter how high Marcus climbed, the destination seemed equally distant. His income increased, but so did everything he considered necessary. The finish line wasn't moving because of money. It moved because of expectations. Companies understand this invisible pattern far better than most consumers realize. Every advertisement quietly suggests that life becomes better after one more upgrade. Eventually, buying better stops feeling like a choice and becomes routine. Marcus finally understood the habit wasn't created overnight, but repeated every ordinary day. The real question became how anyone could escape a habit they rarely noticed. Marcus stopped asking how much he earned and started asking what every new dollar was quietly teaching him. That simple question completely changed the way he looked at every future purchase. Instead of asking, "Can I afford this?" he asked, "Will this become permanent?" The answer surprised him far more often than he expected. Many purchases weren't expensive once. They became expensive because they repeated every month. Marcus realized recurring habits quietly shape financial futures more than occasional spending ever could. A single purchase ends, but a repeated habit keeps asking for more money. That's why small routines often become larger financial commitments than major one-time decisions. Marcus finally saw money as a reflection of habits instead of income. Once he noticed the pattern, every financial decision became easier to understand. He didn't stop enjoying life or refuse every comfort that came his way. He simply became intentional before allowing another expense to become his new normal. Slowly, his lifestyle stopped expanding every time his paycheck became slightly larger. For the first time, his income began growing faster than his expectations. The difference seemed small, but its effects quietly grew every single month. Marcus discovered that wealth isn't built only by earning more money. It's built by preventing every raise from quietly disappearing into everyday habits. The habit you never notice isn't spending. It's allowing normal to become more expensive. Once that invisible pattern becomes visible, money starts following intention instead of routine. Maybe earning more was never the real answer. Maybe protecting each raise from becoming another ordinary habit was the perspective that changes everything.